Hello and welcome to this video on understanding the psychometric tests used by recruiters. So my name's Sophie Redding and I'm one of the careers advisors here at UEA and aligned to the schools of development, education, law, sociology and social work. I've also worked as a recruiter using psychometric tests. So what we're going to do is cover these four main questions. What are the tests? How and why do recruiters use them? How can you get better at them? And what you can do if you don't do well on the tests. As you go through this video, you have the opportunity to pause, to think, to make notes, to look at some of the resources. And there's also the slide set that comes with this video so that you can click on the hyperlinks on the slides. So what are psychometric tests? Psychometric literally means measuring what is in the mind. And there are broadly two categories of psychometric tests used by recruiters: personality questionnaires and ability tests. So what we'll now do is look at each of these types. So personality questionnaires. The first thing to bear in mind is that unlike ability tests, there are no right or wrong answers. Your personality is your personality. There are personality differences, and some personalities may suit different roles or different cultures within organisations better than others. So it's about that cultural fit with the organisation. They assess your preferred style of working, your workplace motivation, or personality traits, including personal strengths. The results of the personality questionnaires should not be used to make recruitment decisions on their own. Often they're used to inform the interview process. So, for instance, if someone says that they are very structured in their work, they like organisation, they like routine, and it's a role that's problem solving, firefighting, you're shipped into different teams to sort things out when they're going wrong. Actually, it might need someone who's a bit more flexible and adaptable, but that shouldn't preclude you from being considered for the role. It should just form part of the interview questions. So you would ask something along the lines of, this shows that you prefer to work in a more structured environment. We have to be very flexible, very adaptable in our work. How do you feel about that? So you would explore it at that stage. So top tips in terms of preparing for the tests, personality questionnaires. You can't practice personality questionnaires as there are no right answers. There's just you and how you prefer to work. But what you can do is work on developing your self-awareness. And there's lots of resources on that hyperlink there. Or come and speak to one of the careers advisors, or to friends and family or people who know you well, to ask them, what do you think my strengths are? How do you think I tend to respond in different circumstances? And the other tip is to be honest in your answers. Don't try to be something that you're not. Usually there's a lot of questions in the questionnaires to ensure consistency. So if each time the question comes up worded in a slightly different way, you're saying relatively the same thing, then it's more likely to be a genuine reflection than if it's different every time. So a little bit fuzzy, here's a screenshot of an example personality questionnaire. You can see the hyperlink at the bottom. It will take you to Graduates First, and you can access this through my CareerCentral as well here at UEA, and it gives you an opportunity to practice some of the questionnaires. There tends to be a statement, and then you have to rate it to say whether you strongly agree, to strongly disagree with that statement. The idea is to try and not overthink it, to work through them quickly and go with your gut feel, and try not to sit on the fence too much with agree nor disagree, because obviously that makes it quite difficult then to kind of assess where you sit on that scale. And you can see here there's an example of the scale. So most people sit where that green bar is, and you can see this person who's answered it is slightly lower on organised, preferring planning, enjoying high attention to detail, and maybe resistant to change. So they're tending towards that rather than the other end of the scale, which is flexible, adaptable to change, spontaneous, etc. Maybe a little bit disorganised. There are pros and cons of both approaches, but it depends on the fit for the role in the organisation, whether that is a requirement. So that's what the sort of thing looks like for a personality questionnaire. So now we'll go on to the ability tests. I'll whip through these quite quickly because you can go back to the links and have a look at them, practice them in your own time, see how you score on them. So feel free to pause the video if it's going too quickly. So verbal reasoning tests are the ability to understand written information and evaluate arguments. Numerical reasoning tests are the ability, as you would expect, to understand numerical data in the forms of tables, statistics, etc. Logical or spatial reasoning tests are the ability to identify underlying patterns in information and predict outcomes using that information. Not all of these tests would be used for different roles. Quite often I'd use the logical and spatial reasoning tests for things like IT programmers, because what you're looking at is seeing patterns in the way that shapes are formed. Situational judgment tests are the ability, as you would expect, to make judgment about a situation in response to a workplace situation. We're seeing a growth in strengths-based judgment tests. So what strengths are you demonstrating in the way you respond to situations? And then there's the Watson-Glaser critical thinking test. It measures critical thinking in 5 areas, you can see here: inferences, recognition of assumptions, deductions, interpretations, and evaluation of arguments. It's used mostly by law firms, a few consultancy firms would use it, and also for the bar course aptitude tests. The Watson-Glaser test will be covered in the other video that is part of this set, and however, the underpinning how to approach tests that we're covering in this recording are relevant for Watson-Glaser tests too. So here are some examples. The verbal reasoning test has a paragraph of information followed by a series of statements, and you have to assess, based purely on the information in the paragraph, that's key, whether the statements are true, false, or it's not possible to say. You can see the hyperlink at the bottom that will take you to the example. So I'll whip through them as I say. If you want to pause, you can have a look at them in your own time. Numerical reasoning tests. So as you can see, graphs, tables, or statistical data, you're then given multiple choice answers to assess which is correct based on the data given. Logical and spatial reasoning tests, as I mentioned, are a series of diagrams, and you have to work out what comes next in the sequence. And all of these, with the examples to work through, are available through Graduates First. Situational judgment tests vary much from organisation to organisation because they are work-related scenarios, and they provide you with different courses of action and ask you what you did. So quite often, if it's a large organisation, they will have their own specific work-related situational judgment tests based on the situations you'd experience. And you might be asked to choose the best course of action, rank the courses of action, or indicate the best course and the worst course of action. So there may not be strictly right or wrong answers, but there may well be expected behaviours for the role. So it might also give you quite an indication of what the role involves, so you can decide whether it's for you. I know a few years ago Tesco's had situational judgment questions on their recruitment page where they were saying it's 10 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve, you are in the supermarket, there is 1 turkey left and 2 customers are fighting over it. What do you do? One of the options was take it off them and tell them neither of them could have it. Another was to ask what their requirements were to see if there were other things that you could offer as alternatives. So you can see you're kind of shouting at the customers and taking it off them, not an option. But what it's also letting you know is that in retail you might be working till late at night on Christmas Eve, for instance, and thinking about how perhaps you would handle working with customers as part of their management training program. So that's just an example. You can see another one on the screen here. So why do recruiters use psychometric tests? It's to better understand the ability and fit of a candidate for the role. So if you're going to be using a lot of numerical data, obviously a numerical reasoning test makes absolute sense. Similarly with verbal reasoning, situational judgments to see how you'd respond in those situations. And it can help objectively select which candidates to progress to the next stage of recruitment. Quite often, when students are sent the link to do the online tests, many of them don't do it, either because they panic, they're not sure they want to, they don't want to put the effort in, actually suggests that you weren't that keen on working for the organisation, so there's a level of self-selection. It's a quick way for the recruiter, at least, not for you if you're having to sit through tests. They're usually about sort of 30 minutes, 40 minutes each. But for them, it's a quick way of putting a lot of candidates through the first stage of recruitment to see who comes through to the next stage. And in that respect, it's objective. It's not based on your kind of background or things like that. It is literally how you have progressed through those assessments. So that does make it very cost effective per candidate, because if you think interviewing with members of staff and things like that can be quite costly in terms of staff time. So that's why they use them. It's quite often quoted that 75% of Times top 100 companies in the UK use psychometric testing as part of their recruitment process. And Times Top 100, it's what the Times newspaper has rated as the top 100 companies. So within that, what you're probably looking at is large companies, because smaller companies won't even sort of feature because the people won't be aware of them perhaps. So it is the larger companies, and it isn't all of them, as you can see. So how do recruiters use psychometric tests? The really important thing to remember here when you're practicing and you're getting that number, it is a percentile, not a percentage. So what it's looking at is a standard deviation curve of performance. So you can see on screen here that average performers would cluster around the middle. So most people will be getting between that 40 and 60th percentile. That's where high performers and low performers, you're seeing a lot less people in those other extremes of the scale. So what they do is they will test what they call norm groups, which is usually a couple of thousand, possibly even more candidates. So you choose then which norm group you want to compare against. So it's usually graduate applicants. So if you get 51%, it does not mean that you got incorrect answers for almost half the questions, the other 49%. That is not the case. It's a percentile. So 51 means the 51st percentile, meaning you performed better than over half of graduate applicants to similar roles. So that's important to look at, because you might be getting your scores and feeling quite disappointed. Actually, you've got to put them in this context. And if you're wondering what percentile recruiters use, it will vary from recruiter to recruiter. When I was recruiting, I used the 40th percentile. So as you can see here, where the majority of people start to fall. For the numerical reasoning test for the accountancy graduate scheme and actuarial scheme that we recruited to, we would want a higher percentile. We wanted people above the 60th percentile because it was a highly numerical role, and that would suggest that those people were better able to handle numerical data. So it will vary. Most recruiters anecdotally tend to be around the 40th or 50th percentile. Not all of them release the information, and the one caveat to that is the Watson-Glaser test. The percentiles tend to be a lot higher, so beyond the sort of upwards from the sort of 60th percentile. So that's the one that's slightly different. But as I say, we've got a separate video on that. So we've looked at what are the tests, why recruiters use them, and how they use them. So now we're going to look at how you can get better at using psychometric tests. So practice, and you've guessed it, practice is absolutely key. There are example tests here. These are all free with the exception of the job test, prep Watson-Glaser test. There is a cost for this, but we've negotiated a 50% discount, a UEA discount. So if you go into your employability pages, you'll be able to see the code for that, which I believe is UEA 50. But if you're struggling to find it, then do get in touch. So why practice? You might think, well, I'm quite good at exams, I'm quite academic, I get good results. But actually, these tests have very specific rules and approaches to them. So here are 6 top tips to help you. As I say, know the rules. You might not agree with the rules, you might not like the rules, but they are the rules that govern how that test is administered and scored. So know them, and then you can help improve your score. So read the instructions really carefully. The more you practice, the more you'll recognise the patterns. The common pattern in the verbal reasoning is to use a statement that you have to say whether it's true, false, or can't say that is really definitive. All Sundays are rainy, for instance. But actually, when you look at the paragraph, it isn't absolutely categorical that all Sundays are. Just some are, or many, but not all. So those are some things to look out for, and you get used to the patterns when you practice. You need to balance being quick and accurate when you're taking the tests. By practicing, you'll know how long it takes you to progress through them, and don't be disappointed if you don't finish. They are designed, with the exception of the Watson Glaser, which is slightly different, is not as time pressured, but most psychometric tests are really time pressured. The idea being that most candidates will not finish them, because if you think back to that standard deviation curve, the only way to differentiate right at that top end of percentiles is by how quick and accurate people can be. And by practicing, you'll find out whether taking just a fraction longer on each question makes you more accurate and gives you a higher score, or whether you're just banging through them quickly is the best way to get them, because you can get it right most times. But don't just randomly guess, because that can impact on your score. So, next tip, learn about your strengths and development areas, and also your preferred working style. So it might be that when it comes to numerical reasoning, you've got a bit rusty with percentages, ratios, reading graphs and tables. So brush up on that. You can use the Learning Enhancement team, the Maths Help Desk there, and that could help you improve. It might be that verbal reasoning is where you've got a bit of a shortfall, and you just need to perhaps practice with that. Potentially as well, if English is an additional language for you, getting used to the way the paragraphs are written. Maybe you're an early bird or a night owl. So if that's the case, try and either practice the tests, or when you're sent the link to do the actual tests, if you can choose when you can do it, choose a time that fits your working style best, when you can be quiet and not interrupted and work at your best. Most importantly, don't panic, and it's so important. We'll have another slide on that in a moment. And similarly, thinking about your mindset, check what mindset you're in when you're approaching the tests. And again, I'll explain that on a subsequent slide. If you have reasonable adjustments for your study, for instance, if you have dyslexia or something similar, then ask for reasonable adjustments, which can be put in place by employers to support you with the time factors on the test there. So I said, don't panic. Important thing to think about. One of the reasons that you might be panicking is perhaps because you've got really high expectations of yourself. If you are already in the higher percentiles of performance, it may be that you do not need to do any more apart from relax, get a good night's sleep before the tests, and then do them. Recognise you're not going to achieve 100%. It is not possible. It's percentiles, and I think the highest percentiles I've ever seen are in the top 90s. I have never ever seen 100%. I don't think it's possible to get it, because it would mean you were just kind of you better than everybody, and in the whole sample group. So going back to what we'd said, if you're performing around sort of the midpoint upwards, you're probably doing okay, particularly if you're 60s, 70s, certainly 80s, 90s. Do not worry about it. Just relax. Try not to get too anxious about them. Maybe it's that you need to improve your score. Panicking is not going to help. So try to focus on what's holding you back. Is it because, as we've said, you need to practice some of the content for the tests? Or is it just the nerves are getting the better of you? So can you use relaxation techniques, focus on your breathing, positive self-talk beforehand? Instead of telling yourself you're going to do really badly on it, I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to approach it positively and do the best I can. And seeking help. So we'll have some links for additional support in a moment. Avoid cramming in terms of this, don't panic. Try not to just cram, spend hours and hours and hours and hours working at it. So try practicing little and often to break it down so it's more manageable. We mentioned mindset. I'm putting this slide here because growth mindset, you may have come across it. It's quite regularly used in the education sector now, so you might have experienced it at school or college or in other areas. And Carol Dweck is an American psychologist, and she looked at how people approached learning and problem solving and identified some people have a fixed mindset where they think that their ability is a fixed amount, you can't grow it, you can't improve, that if you don't do well, it might kind of challenge who you are. She did a study with straight A students at an Ivy League medicine degree in the States. So these are people who'd been straight A students all of their life, and they sat a really complex exam paper. And it was almost impossible to get full marks on it, so most people were disappointed with their grade. People with a fixed mindset felt utterly shaken. I'm a straight A student, that's it, my whole identity is shaken, I'm not who I thought I was. Growth mindset didn't associate that with their whole sense of identity. Okay, this is one paper I've not done as well on, so what do I need to do to get better? And if you're interested in learning more about growth mindset to help you not just with psychometric tests, but in your studies and life in general, there's some links at the bottom to TED Talks and YouTube clips to explain it. And there's a popular book as well, which is in one of the links later on. So think about the mindset. You can improve with practice. Everyone can improve with practice. The other way to think about mindset is if we think about the cognitive behavioural triangle. So the key here is that our thoughts drive our emotions and how we behave. So what we think about, as I say, affects how we feel and act. So it might be that you're thinking, the tests are pointless. What do they prove? Or I should be able to do better than this. Or perhaps even some really negative thinking. I'm stupid. I just can't get a high enough score. I'll never get this. This might lead you to feeling upset, anxious, angry, frustrated, all of which is going to affect your performance on the tests. It will increase your worry. It might put you off taking them. As I say, so many students, we get feedback about a third of applicants drop out at the psychometric test stage because they just don't want to do them. So withdrawing at that process, part of the process. If you've decided the role or the organisation isn't for you, that's fine. But if it's just about your mindset around this test, then do please speak to a careers advisor and we can support you. So here are some of those unhelpful thoughts. You might recognise some of them. And when we talk about unhelpful thoughts, it's actually a psychological term. You can Google unhelpful thinking and find out a little bit more about it, because it includes things like black and white thinking, I'm stupid. Negative thinking, I'll never be able to get this. That's very extreme. With practice, you probably can. So you can see some thoughts here on the left-hand side. What you might want to do now is pause the video and think about how you could reframe that thought. So by reframing, that literally means shifting the focus and thinking about it in a slightly different way so that it's less negative and causes you less kind of anxiety or anger or frustration. So I'll let you read those and perhaps think of some other thoughts that are going through your head when you approach the tests, and then think how you might reframe them. So if you pause it and then restart, you'll see some examples. So I'll give you a moment to pause. And if you are looking for the examples, here are some suggestions. These are just suggestions. You will approach thinking in different ways. You're all individual. So, I'm stupid. Well, actually, you wouldn't be studying a UEA law degree if you were stupid. So that's an example of that black and white thinking. So thinking then about, okay, clearly I'm not stupid. I just need to get better at practicing these tests. I'll never get this. Well, if you take a growth mindset, you can get better with practice. It's incremental. So I was working with a student who the first time they took the tests got the 10th percentile because they just didn't know what to expect. And now they're getting 60th percentile after a couple of weeks or so of practice. Maybe you don't agree with the tests. Whether you do or you don't, they are a hoop you need to jump through for certain roles or certain employers. So accepting that will help you practice them with perhaps a little bit of a less negative attitude. You might be thinking, I should be able to do better. Always be careful when you hear should. Try and flip it into a could. I could do better with practice. So I will identify which areas I need to improve and seek help to do this. So it takes away some of those expectations. People are kind of pushing you, how are you getting on with them? Are you getting the results you need? Switch off from that and think, what do I need to do to improve and how can I seek help to do it? You might be thinking, well, I thought I was smart. You probably are, most likely so. These tests measure very specific ways of thinking. So you might find it a little bit more difficult to get to grips with them. You can be really smart in lots of other areas, and these tests do not take away from that. You might think there's no point in me doing the tests, but if you want to access that role or organisation, then you are going to need to practice. And a common one that students say is that everyone will be better than me. This is another example of unhelpful thinking, comparing and despairing. You can't control how others perform in the tests. What we also tend to do is we tend to be quite negative on our assessment of ourselves and overly positive about how others perform, so it makes it look like an even more amplified gap. Just forget about the other people. You can't control how they perform. You can only focus on your own performance, so keep focused on that. So, in terms of the support that's available to you, we've got online resources, and there's a hyperlink here. Try the Recruiter's Own website. What tips do they give to help you with the tests? Speak to a careers advisor or speak to your employability director. So Ellen and Tim as well will be pleased to speak to you to support you with this process. Come along to the how-to workshops where we've got a how-to workshop including building resilience, and in that we look at challenging unhelpful thinking, circles of control, so you're not able to control others' performance, so how you work with that. So that might give you some useful tips and techniques. I've mentioned the learning enhancement team, so they might be able to support you with English as an additional language. They can support you if you have a specific learning difference, such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, and the maths help desk as well can help. If you're finding that your anxiety and nerves is far greater than just that understandable adrenaline rush before you take the tests and is affecting more areas in your life, then that's beyond the scope of careers, and it would be student services wellbeing teams, and there's teams there to help you, either the embedded teams or the central teams. Speak to friends who are good at the tests. How did they approach them? So I know someone who was really good at the Watson Glaser test, frustratingly good at it. And so they talked through their thought process as they went through it, which helped me see it in a completely different light, and then helped me think about how I approach them in future. And there are some books here. So we talked about Carol Dweck and Growth Mindset. There's a popular book for that. There's also a popular book by Professor Steve Peters, The Chimp Paradox, and that's about managing your inner chimp, that kind of fight, flight, freeze response. So how you can manage that positively. Different things work for different people, so you may or may not get on with them. And, that's appeared in a slightly different place, but what if you can't do well on the tests? Well, not all recruiters use psychometric tests, especially small and medium-sized organisations. So perhaps it's about looking at different organisations. And what we're seeing is that some organisations now are moving away from the ability test to use more of a strengths-based recruitment approach. If you look at Reed and Smith's website, for instance, they recently moved to strengths-based judgment tests and removed the competency-based interviewing and the verbal and numerical reasoning tests. Some recruiters use the test as part of the overall assessment, not as a first stage pass or fail. Large recruiters with large numbers of applicants might use that first stage as, if you don't meet the percentile, you don't pass to the next phase. But others, particularly if they're not as large, might use it as part of the overall assessment. So if you don't do as well on the ability test, but you show real strengths and abilities in other areas, then it will balance that out. You might want to consider other roles within the organisation. So particularly with organisations, if you were applying to the graduate scheme, then you might think, oh, actually, I'm going to apply for single roles within the organisation that aren't part of that large scheme and perhaps have a different recruitment process. It may be if you didn't pass the, particularly around the personality or the strengths-based questions and judgment tests, that it's not the right role for you. If you didn't perform as highly on the numerical reasoning, and it's a very numerical role, chances are you wouldn't really thrive in it anyway. And it might be that based on your personality and strengths type that the commercial fit with you and the organisation isn't a match. So a bit of an example there in the picture, a square peg in a round hole. So there will be lots of square holes waiting for square pegs, but perhaps it's just not with this organisation. Maybe you are highly commercially driven and the organisation isn't. Or maybe the organisation is highly commercially driven and you're not. It might be that perhaps you're more collaborative and the organisation is looking for more sort of lone working independent approach, or vice versa. Or it might be very traditional and structured and perhaps hierarchical, and you might be looking for more of a non-traditional, flatter structure that would suit you better. So that's what it means by cultural fit. So here's some links to contact the UEA Careers Service if you want to book an appointment to discuss anything career related. This is just a slide promoting all of the different things that we offer through CareerCentral. I'm sure you're well aware, but you've got some hyperlinks there. And then I'd finish with asking you, what steps are you going to take next to help you with your psychometric tests? So have a think. Think about how confident you feel about approaching them. Maybe give yourself a score from 1 to 10, 1 being no idea what they are or how to approach them, 10 being, yeah, pretty much know what I'm doing and I feel quite confident. And think, what would I need to do to move to the next point up that scale? And how are you going to do it? Maybe make a note now just as we finish the video. So thank you very much. I will end the video here.